Each year, we try to have at least one debate, if not two, at the various conferences, and we were thinking of which topics we wanted to do this year. One of the things we thought about was disparate impact, but we had to find someone who knew as much as Randall did to actually debate him, and we couldn't find anyone. But another perennial favorite is, of course, rail, and should it be expanded or not. And we're very fortunate to have two what I would consider rail experts arguing for the fact that Austin should be expanding its rail network is Dave Dobbs, who you've all been introduced to. Arguing against is this Tom Rubin guy. I don't know if you've ever seen him before or not, but he's here as well. And Catherine, Kirsten was supposed to be here, but she is under the weather. So you've got me again. Yes, I know. So for the whole debate, we've come up with a structure, a total of 75 minutes. It might be less than that. That is the maximum amount of time if all of the speakers take all of their allotted time. We're going to start out with basically for the resolution, and for the introductory statements, both for and against, the speakers have 15 minutes each, which is one of the reasons we're in this room listening to this charming whatever's going on over here, is because we need to have the audio-visual equipment for that. If we're not, depending on how things go, we might have you move back in that room again, because, we just love to have you move around. After that will be a rebuttal. For side goes first, the against side goes 10 minutes each. Then we're going to have 10 minutes for questions for the moderator, which is me. Now, the type of questions we want to have are constructive questions. We don't want to have a question such as, I think all light rail vehicles should be crashed into with a Hummer. Do you agree? Those are not the type of questions I'm going to select, so don't ask them. We'll ask the questions when we're doing the rebuttal time. You all should have some paper in front of you that you can write a question down. Please make it legible. If I can't read it, I'm not going to ask it. And then we will lastly, after 10 minutes of question, have the closing argument. The against is going to go first, and then the for will go, because the for is the one making the case. Each of the closing sides has 5 minutes. And so without any further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get started with Dave.
Thank you, Baruch. Not sure just how I'm going to do this. Okay, let me go up to the podium. Thanks, Tom. All right. If you're as deaf as I am, some of you, why I probably need to do this, and I apologize for my ineptitude. I have a very bad hearing problem. Anyway, this is the debate topic, and I started it out on the front. I'm Dave Dobbs, and I've lived here for 46 years. I've been involved in transit for 40 years. I'm a widower. I have 3 children. 2 of them are retired school teachers here in Austin. I'm a teacher by trade. I was a military Navy officer for 6 years of my life before I came to Austin, and I've made Austin my home because I don't like to be up in Minneapolis where I have to go next week because it's too down cold. All right, so let me start out and talk about what is, and then I'll talk about what I think should be, and then we'll turn it over to Tom, let him do what he's going to do. Let's see. This is the current situation. We have a Capital Metro, which is a publicly funded agency with a 1-cent tax, although a quarter-cent of it has been robbed by the city of Austin for the last 30 years to build whatever they wanted to build. They didn't want to raise taxes, so they took Capital Metro's money. They just recently gave it back. And these are the things that we have. We have a ride share, a van pool. We have a Metro bus. We have special transit, and we now have a Metro Rapid, which they hope to turn into a dedicated lane system. And then we also have the Metro Rail commuter line. It's not truly a light rail line. It's more of a Schnellbahn, like Europe. It's a commuter type train. And we are talking about a future light rail line, probably not a thing that would be popular from what I see here, but that is probably going to come back up. This is Capital Metro. You can find this on Wikipedia. It's an error. It says July 1st, 86. It was formed in July 1st, 85. I was there. The other big publicly proposed funded transit project being talked about for Austin, San Antonio, and Central Texas. Funding date of construction and revenue service unknown is the Lone Star commuter rail service, Lone Star District. You can see it's 118 miles from Georgetown to San Antonio. You can see all the towns over on the side there that are going to have stations along the way. And it is an effort to do something about I-35, which is impossible. Here are some of the things the Lone Star people are saying about their project. It's a conventional heavy rail commuter operation with a locomotive on the front and rail cars in the back. It's 1 hour and 15 minutes to Austin to San Antonio. They say up to 32 trips daily. It's 118 miles from Georgetown to San Antonio. They think they'll be able to carry 3,840 passengers per hour in each direction. They cost to relocate the UP and build the LSR system is $3.1 billion. The equivalent lane capacity of 4 lanes, they say, $7 billion is what that would cost. So from their perspective, it's a bargain. Congestion-proof, stress-free mobility. Estimated Lone Star ridership, 3.2 million to 5.8 million annual boardings in 35. Lone Star passengers' annual savings, they say, will be 17.4 million to 30.19 million. It greatly facilitates choice trips, which people don't take. I don't drive to San Antonio unless I absolutely have to. I don't drive I-35 unless I have to, because it's so totally unreliable. And it's also very, very stressful. Relocation improves freight operations because it'll be moved out of the way. It improves automobile grade crossings, and San Marcos has terrible problems. Their freight trains block the crossings all the time. Shorter, faster trains will mean less problem. Attracts and promotes transit-oriented development, density, in other words, in the member cities' cores, increase their tax base, and more efficient urban development. Okay. What's not known is what's really happening. The news media is absolutely oblivious to this. It'll happen incrementally and under the general public radar screen. It will happen without a public vote. It will need only a few localized art gallery public hearings. That we like those in Austin. We don't really want to hear from you. We have some things up around, whether it's the highway department or Capital Metro or the city. We just put things up and let you wander around and ask questions. Anyway, it will be approved by city boards, commissions, the Austin City Council, and the Capital Metro Board, and very few realize it will realize what's happening until the bulldozers arrive to tear up the city's major thoroughfares in front of homes and buses, businesses. Yes, 2 vehicle travel lanes will be taken away from Austin drivers. The buses are coming. And here's what's coming. This is the documents that show this. This is from 2012 in May. It shows that they plan to spend $500 million to build dedicated bus lanes on all of the major thoroughfares where light rail might go. The mayor piously said we just can't take away vehicle lanes for rail, yet we can take them away for buses. So that's why I say people don't realize this. Now here is what they plan to do. Those little lime green lines, those are the major streets where the most traffic is in the city besides I-35. And they're going to put dedicated bus lanes on them, 18 miles of dedicated buses, taking away the vehicle lanes. This is the Campo document, the Metropolitan Planning Organization. This shows that they've set aside, earmarked, $422 million for this project. 230 million, 1 million on one end and 200 and some million on the other. So they're going ahead with this project. So what's the problem? Isn't taking vehicle lanes for dedicated buses better than using those travel lanes for rail? Unless Austin has another light rail election, Austin will become a major test for think rail, use buses. Buses require no public referendum, rail does. Buses get 80% federal funding, but rail only gets 50. Less local bus funding match is much less and thus much easier to get than rail fund. Don't have anyone tell you that the federal government favors rail projects, because it doesn't. The funding process and everything is a bus-orientated situation at the Federal Transit Administration. Now, the real problem is that buses cannot handle the potential ridership even on exclusive route. Let's look at the roadway capacity. Now, here's the major streets, and you can see that I-35 Loop 1 and North Lamar are right up there on the top of Texas' streets for congestion. And the only choice that the city has to improve capacity is North Lamar, South Lamar, Congress, because they don't own I-35 and they don't own Millpack. So that's their only place they can increase capacity. Now, there is an example of the roads in the center of the city. We're very concentrated. And we have about 30% of the region's employment located right in the middle, with the university, the downtown, and the Capitol complex all within a few blocks of each other. Now, here are some common misperceptions. That I-35 through Central Texas is, these are beliefs common to people around here. They think the traffic is through traffic causes the congestion. They think truck traffic is the major problem, and that Central Texas can build enough road and transit capacity to eliminate I-35 congestion. Now, here's the reality. This is from the Texas Transit Institute. I'm taking these quotes. Based on the available data, local traffic represents 86% of the traffic on I-35. That means they're all trying to get into the core, where the jobs are, where a great percentage of the jobs are, over 30%. So the through traffic, the traffic that you may think should be bypassing Austin, is not the primary cause of Central Texas I-35 congestion. Computers and other trips with an origin or destination in the Austin area are the major factor influencing I-35 congestion, not through travelers. Now, here's some other things out there. And those red, basically, Ginger Gooden, the engineer who did this, she said in 2 presentations I listened to, she says there's no magic bullet. You have to have a whole combination of things to relieve this. And what TxDOT's approach is to spend billions of dollars from Dallas to San Antonio trying to build enough lanes. Well, how do you build enough lanes through a city like Austin, where you'd have to take out part east campus of the university? Okay, thanks, Rubin. All right, so anyway, that's the problem. We're very, very compressed in the middle, and they've got to find some way to move enough people into the middle of that core. All right, the solution, this is my shtick here. This is what I think should be done, and it's based on some other studies that we've done in the past, based on that failed 2000 rail election numbers the FTA presented. The old Dallas-San Antonio highway is Loop 275, basically is North Lamar, Guadalupe through the center of the city, and South Congress all the way out to South Park Meadows, about 21 miles. This would be my objective, is to convert that old loop into a reserved lanes with light rail on the surface. Be faster on the outside, it'll be slow in the middle because you've got a lot of people to pick up in the middle. And what it would do with big parking rides is drain off some of that local traffic. Now, the objective here, attract commuter line. Austin's a line village from north to south. It would greatly improve what you call a failed metro rail, because it would greatly improve connections, because people get off and go onto the light rail and come right down to the core. There is the section that's most critical, 6 miles from the river up to the North Lamar Transfer Center. 40,000 a day is what the FTA says will ride that line. And that was from the 2000 election, and we've already built way past McNeil out to Leander. So this thing is, there's the ridership is there. Okay, these are the reasons, I think. One, you got to honor the neighborhoods who have long wanted this system. You've got to honor the city ordinances which call for this system. At Guadalupe, North Lamar, the highest density of transit ridership in the city. There's 20,000 bus riders in there. How much time I got? 3 minutes, thanks. North Lamar corridors, primed, dense for mixed-use development, offering a range of housing for Austin big ridership attacks, big investments. And the thing is that you got to realize the failed election that Jim and I worked on, they were basically running a line over to support some developers for you know, projects that wouldn't help anybody except the upper middle class. Corridor connects 7 major activities, unmatched by any corridor. The success of Guadalupe would ensure that we build out the 20 miles that I was talking about. All right, there is some idea of the big dots. You see them there, triangle, and the Texas Department of State Complexes, the West Campus, and various possibilities down there, this downtown CBD and the state capitol. And this shows you some of the numbers on the line, the employment numbers. And this is where I think this would be, I would electrify the metro rail on that, for that blue line out there that's now the red line all the way up, and that would greatly improve service in there. And then I would link Miller and the new housing development over here. You could do all that for about $1 billion, and that's cheap compared to what they want to spend on I-35 and won't get them anything. Now, I go through this. I'm not going to spend more time because I'm about out of it. That would be a fully developed loop. This would be what a 2050 rail loop might look like. Then it's got a lot of different things in it. And that's the end. And I'm going to turn it over to Tom and let's tear it up, buddy.
Well, surprisingly, we are actually in agreement on a number of things. Not everything, so I'll keep talking. I'm going to be talking, I plan to talk mainly about urban rail, which is heavy rail, light rail, streetcar primarily. What I wasn't planning on talking about much was intercity rail, but I am going to now that we get into that. Right now, what rail service do we have in or through Austin? Well, we have 1 Amtrak train a day in each direction. We do have proposals for Texas high-speed rail, which probably, let's just say, at best, it's going to be quite a while before it gets to Austin, and that's at best. And then you already heard a description of Lone Star Rail District, and we'll get back to that a little bit in the rebuttal, so I'm not going to spend time on that. Okay, here's the history of urban rail in Austin. The private streetcar system, like almost every town of any size, had, and it died pretty much of natural causes. Last line was taken out in 1940 and replaced by bus. Capital Metro was established by state statute with a 1% sales tax. Very clearly, it was always intended that there would be a big, long look at rail with the expectation it would be built. During the late 1900s, they had a bunch of major problems. The state legislature came down and said, if you want to build rail, you got to go to the voters. And that's what happened in 2000. Jim led the team. Boy, did he lead the team. A couple of us in the room here, not Bob Charles, but Wendell, you were there. Who am I forgetting? And I were very happy to have a little to do with that. Okay, now, then, as you've heard, we had a couple more elections. Now, one thing that is interesting about Capital Metro is it has a very low fare box recovery ratio. I found this to be astonishingly low, even for some of the places in Texas that have low fare box ratio. Okay. Now, then, of course, we had the 2014 election. That was defeated by a fairly wide margin. And again, when you have pro-rail people who say, no, this is bad. That should say something, and that we're certainly in agreement. And we have Light Rail Now, which is a national institution that's headquartered here, certainly has a big presence here. That's who we have represented here. Known some of these people for a long time, so we're going to have fun. Okay, now Austin is an extremely difficult city to serve with any type of transportation. like many southern cities, until we had air conditioning widely available, it was kind of a small town. It was the state capital, but it was growing rather slowly, even with the big university. So when the planning for the interstate highway system, what became it, was being done, Austin was not a very high priority. It got I-35, pardon me, which is the major line for NAFTA trading, and there are huge truck traffic through here. That is a major problem. One thing to keep in mind is it is a major cost to all of our commerce because of the holdups and the inconsistency trying to get through that bottleneck. This isn't the only one in Austin, but it is certainly one of the worst. Okay, there hasn't been a real freeway network in the sense that most places have. There is no ring as such, no capital beltway or anything remotely close. Not what you have in other Texas cities. Houston is well into its fourth ring. Here we don't even have one, not even half of one. So there have been a lot of actions coming on lately to make improvements, but as we've seen, as we've heard, these are mainly toll finance, which personally I think is a good thing. Now, most transit professionals think that the easiest thing to work with for moving cars and moving transit is a grid system. Okay, keep going. We should have a map. Okay, of Austin. Sorry, I wasn't watching. Skip all of this stuff. There we go. That's what we want. So what you want really to deal with is a grid system. Now, the good news is Austin not only has a grid system, it has several of them. Downtown, here's one here. There's another one up there, another one over there, and, parts of another one there, and then a lot of very strange roadways. And if you look at the major roads, what you see is all kinds of places where grid systems do not match up. They come together on different alignments. Does not work very well for anything. And this makes it very difficult to do much. Also, the historical pattern consisted of small blocks and narrow streets, which means you have a lot of intersections. This is difficult to deal with. We did have for a long time a one-way street system which helped to move all kinds of rubber tire traffic. It's actually even more important for buses than it is for cars for a variety of reasons. But even that now is being reversed in some cases. Okay, keep going. Sorry, just as I flip the pages, I'll try to signal. Okay, so it's very difficult to even go a mile on a main street without a turn or a weird intersection that throws things down. Keep going. Okay, if you can see me flip a page, let's try this. Okay. All right, now we're too far. I'll catch up. Another interesting thing is Austin is a very bright blue patch in a very red state. So trying to get support for transit from the state is difficult. Until very recently, there wasn't much state funding. There is some now, and we'll get to that. But also, Capital Metro, being Capital Metro, comes under a huge amount of scrutiny. The legislature has been very supportive in local sales taxes. If you people want to vote for it, fine. Go ahead. But as far as money from the state, again, hard to do, slow. Austin has also had some typical weird real estate cycles. First there's a forest of cranes, and then you come by 3 years later and it's full of see-through skyscrapers. And that's happened a couple of times. A lot of developments concentrated around downtown. The biggest employer, surprise, is government. Next is professional, many of whom are serving the government. And fourth, after retail, is third, is education. And that's well over half of the entire employment. And much of it is concentrated either downtown or in the university area. But that is starting to change. For decades, we've seen more movement to the suburbs. just like everything else. And it's also something, okay, I will try to catch up. Give me a moment. Well, this shows what has happened to transit in Austin. What we have had over this period is 75% growth in the 5-county metropolitan area. The expenditures on transit are up 75%, and that's inflation adjusted. Passenger miles are up about 41%, in large part due to longer distance travel, both commuter bus and, of course, the train we rode. But boardings are only up 10%, while the total population was going up 75%. Not good. Next. Okay, here's the distribution. Now, notice that we start at 24 down there. If I started at 0, you couldn't see what was going on up here. And what we have is over 95% of the total trips are on bus. And frankly, that ain't going to change much anytime soon. Okay, now, what we wrote on is hybrid rail. This is a federal term of art. Okay, keep going. And what are the alternatives to hybrid rail? Well, there's several. The most important is commuter bus, long-haul commuter express transit service. Okay, tell you what. Thanks for trying.
5 minutes.
Thank you. Well, this is something that we were doing quite a bit in Austin, but it was cut back, particularly since a lot of it was replaced, including some of the best lines, by the hybrid rail, the Metrolink that we rode on. If you look at the statistics, they're fairly comparable on the average trip length. The hybrid rail is faster, but remember, commuter bus can go through the neighborhoods and pick up people next to their home. And once it gets downtown, it can go through downtown and drop people off next to their jobs. So that kind of speed, when you do it origin to destination, it's roughly comparable. As far as the passenger loads, given the size of the vehicles, they're roughly similar. Okay, now let's get into cost. It's expensive. Look at the subsidy, $12.40 per passenger versus $10.99. So there's a premium being paid there, even though the fare is higher. Okay, sorry, my own thing here. For passenger miles, the difference is even larger in importance, because this is the type of thing where hybrid rail really should do well. Now, the other problem we have wasn't well planned. Frankly, the planners didn't know what they were doing. It is very overcrowded in the morning, to the point where it's not attractive service. So what we have is a recent authorization from the state, $50 million to buy 4 cars, $12.5 million a car. This is extremely expensive, and I hope they can be operated. What I'm afraid of, it's a single track line. You can't extend the cars. You can't run 2 at the same time. The stations are not long enough, and since it's single track, you have to have the passing tracks in the right place. I hope that was well thought out. Okay. Cost $140 million capital to put it in. Bus comparable would have been about $22 million, and big difference, big difference. Okay. Now, does rail do development? Well, here is one study on streetcars, and Kenosha, Wisconsin, $150 million worth of development, Little Rock 400. Look at the ridership. So what does this mean? It means that in these cities, each streetcar rider there and back each day is worth between $700,000 and $2.4 million. One person riding back and forth a day creates that much development. Anybody believes that? I have some lovely oceanfront property in Nebraska I think you might be very interested in. Okay. Now, is transit clean green? Not really. We have been doing not much with emissions and energy use for transit. That has been very, very constant for years. Cars have been going up. Now, there are certainly places where transit does do very well, such as New York City, where you have very, very high passenger loads. But overall, not good, and this place does not have high passenger loads, with the exception of hybrid rail, and what they're going to do is try to double the service to bring it down to a reasonable load. Okay, so it's green, but it's just not bright green. Now, I don't like BRT either when it's BRT heavy with dedicated lanes. There's just no reason for it. I fought that in many places. I will say this. I was asked to say something good about BRT heavy. Well, it's nowhere near as dumb as light rail. The alternative is BRT light, where you have the low-cost capital improvements to add speed, but not the dedicated lane. And you can normally get 80% of the speed advantage for 5% of the capital cost. And with your savings, you can add many, many more lines, really covering an area, rather than just one line. As far as, well, I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Okay, Dave, 10 minutes. And this would be about the time to start after hearing the initial presentation, taking the questions, and collecting them in about 15 minutes.
Well, first of all, Tom, I'd like to make a slight correction to some of the figures that you had. The cost of the rail car is not $12.5 million, it's $6.7 million, and they were up in price from the $5.5 million that they cost originally because of inflation and because of some improvements that had to be made to meet the FRA requirements. The rest of that money is going to hopefully do the thing that you expected of them, is put in some sidings and build a downtown station, and so that they can have these 15-minute headways instead of the 30-minute headways that they, 30 to 35-minute headways that they have presently. All right, let's go back to the statement that that rail died a natural death. Rail did not die a natural death in America. Rail died a death of government. The problem with rail in America was that it was all privately operated, and between 1898 and 1920 we built over 500 electric light rail lines of various types, streetcars and urban rail and so forth, and by 1975 there were only 7 of them left. Now the reason for that was because the government was subsidizing roads. Roads appeared to be free. And by the time you got into the New Deal, you can, if you want, you can blame it all on the Roosevelts, but I don't want to do that. I want to say that, especially during the New Deal, we really ramped up road building, and we really ramped up the building of the suburbs, and the reason that we did it is because we were in an economic disaster. And we gave lots of loans. The government got into the business of loaning money to houses, but you couldn't buy a house in the city. You had to buy a house in the suburbs. And so the result of that is that we had a completely uneven-handed situation with where government spent money. We spent money to build fringe development farther and farther out, and we're still doing it. Now that is a subsidy that costs the taxpayer, because we give subsidies to you and me. I'm a suburbanite. We own our homes, and we get a subsidy for buying the house in the form of a tax deduction. But renters don't get that, and renters make up a large people in the city. So rail lines died because of the government's interference in the marketplace, because the ideal world was privately operated transit, and it worked wonderfully. But the governments imposed restrictions on it. They wouldn't let them raise fares. They made them pay for the streets. In 1935, they came along and said the electric companies that were extending rail lines could not beat the losses of their transit system against the profits of their electric company. In other words, what I'm saying is that we created a system whereby the private trolley car companies were operating with their hands behind their backs, and that's why they went away. Now, of course, some people come up with the GM conspiracy. It's true. The GM tore out a lot of lines, but they were pretty dead by the time they got to them. They were, acting more like vultures than they were like lions, They were eating dead bodies. There were exceptions to that, of course. All right. Now, as far as Austin is concerned, and all the low fares you talk about, the reason is that's a public policy here. I've tried to argue against it. We should have higher transit fares, and we should give the people who need transit subsidies, give it to them in some way so they can ride the bus. But don't give me a subsidy to ride it. And so that's the big problem with what we've done. We're spending at the national level about 4 times as many dollars for roads as we're spending for public transit. Again, that's a complete imbalance. So you have to think about where the money is going and who's putting it out and why private industry is not, going out and building any new streetcar lines or building any transit systems. Now, there are examples. There are examples of megabus and so on, private companies that are operating, but they're basically operating on already existing infrastructure that's already been built there by the government. It's an invalid comparison to compare the whole region to transit ridership in the city. And the reason it's invalid is because we keep spending all of our resources out in the suburbs, and so we increase the number of automobile trips, and therefore it looks like we've lost market share in our transit. Well, we haven't lost market share. It's simply the fact that there hasn't been any transit built out there. The Red Line is an exception, the Metro Rail. That we build out to the suburbs is amazing, but it happened because a Republican legislator wanted it, a very conservative Republican. He wanted it for his constituents. In the same way that many of these legislatures want more roads for their suburbs because they know who votes. We've got to start asking ourselves, as especially us older folks, about the policies that we've all enjoyed in getting these subsidies. I deduct my taxes. I've got a line of credit right now. I'm mortgaging my house. I could pay it off tomorrow. How much time I got there, Brooke? Okay. Now, as far as commuter buses through the neighborhoods, I thought that was an interesting idea. Well, the problem with this idea that you can have better service and higher ridership point to point is certainly disproved by the Shirley Busway in Washington. The Shirley Busway has never got that many ridership rides in Washington compared to Metro Rail. Metro Rail was built and the ridership soared. And the Shirley Busway still to this day does not get that many riders. And as far as the ridership on buses, when the trolleys went away, that was when ridership dropped. You can read Ed Tennyson's paper on this online. It's there, and he explains in a very concise way, and incidentally, it's a peer-reviewed paper by the Transportation Research Board. Now you got to remember, it's one thing to write a paper; it's another thing to pass muster with people who go back and check the facts. So that's a very important point. Now, the reason that Austin highways and so forth have proceeded as they have has been largely, they talk about with the legislature and so on, is because of land speculators and developers in the fringe. You got to remember the Metropolitan Planning Organization is completely and totally controlled by the suburbs. Williamson County, Hayes County, Bastrop County, and their mission, if you're one of their representatives, is to go in and mine the city for dollars because you can't get elected otherwise. Round Rock thinks that it's going to be the next great city in this area without understanding it's only great because it's connected to Austin. You have to have connectivity. And there's no place, no way to build that connectivity without getting capacity, and there's no way to get capacity unless you want to tear up the city. You can tear out the university if you want to, and try to build enough lanes. And the cost of that is far higher than building commuter rail up and down the line, and it's far higher than building a really good light rail system and connecting it. And you'll also get better bus performance. Now, people can come in and give you numbers, but it's a matter of how you interpret their money. If you think you can run 118 buses, 68 buses an hour on a street, I beg to differ with you. And if you think that there's 5 people, national average per automobile on a freeway lane, you got to think about that one too, because if you're out there driving around, I've never seen 5 people on every car around me. If you think you can get 10,000 people on a freeway lane, good, I hope you can figure out how to do it, because I haven't. Now, these are the kinds of numbers I'm seeing. You've got to be realistic. And you also have to realize that streets need to be for people, not traffic sewers, because we have to live in the city. And you got to remember that in Austin, we have a very vibrant core. And unless we figure out a way to put more of the growth inside of the city, concentrated in small apartments and dense living that people can afford, then we're going to have a real problem maintaining the health and vitality of the city, because the tax base is moving out. And that's happening because all of the goodies and all of the subsidies are for the suburbs. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the correction on Metro Rail on the 50 million. I read 2 stories. I should have done more, obviously. Okay. As far as the Lone Star Transit Authority, Rail Authority, I've looked at the numbers, and frankly, I have a very hard time getting that high. If you're talking about 3.2 to 5.8 million, I do comparisons to comparable systems. We have a inner-city rail that is fairly similar to that in California, running from Sacramento, actually Auburn, down to the Bay Area. And this is regarded as fairly successful, and there's a total population of more than 10 million along that corridor. And that's carrying currently about 10 million a year. Actually, not quite 10 million a year. And this is going to be somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 or even 60% is questionable to me. In Southern California, we have Metrolink, which is our commuter rail, which covers 6 counties, total population over 15 million. Some of these are very long trips, up to and over 60, 70 miles. And the whole system with 8 lines is carrying about 15 million a year. So it just doesn't add up that there's that much traffic available, particularly since in LA and also in Sacramento to the Bay Area, on those lines, there is much, much more development all the way along the line, rather than having 2 big things at the end. If you're going to go to BRT, and I have looked at this extensively, if you're going to do it with dedicated alignments, the speed and the carrying capacity between light rail and that type of service is roughly comparable. As long as the alignment and what you have there as far as grade separations, etc., are comparable, very, very little difference. If you go to freeway service, here, frankly, a good bus system can beat almost any commuter system. On the El Monte Freeway, we have a busway. This is I-10 coming into LA from the east. The total carrying capacity of the busway HOV lane exceeds that of the 4 general purpose lanes on one of the heaviest used freeways in the U.S. The Port Authority bus terminal in New York City has 700 buses an hour, 30,000 riders an hour coming in through that corridor. So you can carry very high ridership on bus if you set up for it. What sells transit is speed. Really, you need speed. If you have a light rail line that would go through central Austin, it will have to travel at very low speed. It could wind up, frankly, quite a bit like what we have with the Main Street toy trolley in Houston, 13 miles an hour, and it became known locally as the Wham Bam Tram because of all of its accidents. Just going very slowly through an area where there's too damn many cross streets. And they did it in a very clumsy way. Not a real good reason to do anything like that. A good bus system, including rapid bus, which means no guideway but the other advantages, has great potential to do much more. You can do it quicker. You don't need an environmental clearance of any type. And you can do several of them for the cost of one, either BRT heavy or light rail. And BRT heavy, the capital costs are generally well under 50% of light rail for about, again, the same capacity, all else equal. The light rail system that you just saw was approximately 100 million a mile. This is very low by today's standards. Now, this is nothing as expensive as some of the crazy things that are going on in Sacramento and San Francisco, where we're seeing over $1 billion a mile for some of these. It isn't going to be that bad. They aren't going subway or anything crazy like that. But it's very, very expensive when you go through a crowded city. The utility relocation, every time you see a manhole cover, there's something down there. And it needs to be looked at and very often needs to be relocated. And that's extremely expensive and really screws up the streets doing it. Certainly the state PUCs and others did a great deal to destroy the streetcar system, but basically it was a technology whose time had come and gone. The General Motors National City Line myth is just that, a myth. Streetcars were dying all over the world at that time, and in most of the cities in the U.S. where streetcar was done away with, General Motors came nowhere close to it. What General Motors did, they should have gotten a medal for it. What they did was take out failing streetcar lines that were worth nothing, rip out the tracks, replace them with buses, and that allowed transit to operate on the public sector through the Depression, during World War II, without public subsidy. Streetcar, there were a couple places that streetcar was still there and was very active. My God, if you were getting to the Philadelphia Naval Yards, for example. But by and large, they were failing, they couldn't operate, they couldn't be paid for it, there was no way to pay for it. Buses kept transit alive for 2 to 4 decades, depending on the city. The growth of roads, some of you may have seen a paper I did for this group a few years back where I showed that roads are not subsidized. When you look at all of the money that is collected by the people who use roads, including the sales tax that is paid on gasoline and the sales tax that is paid on the purchase of cars, and other things that are paid by people who use roads, the amount paid in exceeds what is paid out for roads. Roads, until very recently, when we stopped funding the Highway Trust Fund out of user fees and have been doing diversions, roads were making money for government, but the accounting was crazy. We had money coming out of the Highway Trust Fund for non-highway things, while we had local property taxes going in to pay for local roads and all kinds of crazy switches like that. It was hard to do. I spent a lot of time. The report's there, be my guest. If you're a renter, you do get the tax advantages of being able to deduct property taxes and deduct the interest paid on loans. Your landlord gets that. Your landlord reduces the rent because they're getting a tax benefit. Every landlord, every place, every time? No, but overall they have to, because that's how the market works. If they try to not pass that along, they are going to be in trouble. We heard a quote that roads get about 4 times the money spent as transit. And I have a slightly different number, but I'll accept that. But the other side of that is that roads carry 40 times the passenger traffic measured in trips as transit, and they carry a very sizable share of the freight movements, which transit doesn't do. And freight is very important. So yes, there is more spending on roads. That's where the heavy lifting is done, folks. That's where America moves. And by the way, the biggest transit in the U.S. is rubber tires, buses, demand responsive, running on roads, which they don't pay for. Thank you. Actually, when I was the chief financial officer of the Southern California Rapid Transit District, we ran 180 buses an hour in each direction on Broadway. As I mentioned, 700 an hour Port Authority bus terminal. As for MPOs, I think we share a disdain for MPOs. And the funny thing is, if you live in a city, you hate your MPO because everything is going to the suburbs. And if you live in a suburb, you hate the MPO because everything's going to the city. That's the way government works in this country. Thank you.
Okay, so we're now going to have a brief question round. I looked around and we have some really good questions, so thank you. That's great. To keep this fair, because I'm not a moderator in one of the Republican debates where I ask people what their favorite color is and what that says about their personality, I'm going to ask a question to both of the panelists, and they're going to answer it. They're sort of neutral down the middle questions, and even if you wrote it for one of the panelists, I'm going to change it a little bit. So here we go. This is the, and 1 minute each on the answers, so got to be brief. Okay, so discuss again the carrying capacity of the light rail line versus the bus line. You had made a quote, Dave, of the fact that the light rail line can carry as many people as a freeway, and I think we've got some question as to that. So.
I don't believe I said it was carry as many as a freeway. It can carry as many as a freeway lane. It depends upon how you design it. But basically, you could a line running on North Lamar or Guadalupe could carry as many as say 8,000 people an hour. And the way that it would do that is by running trains. Say, I think you'd have to run trains about every 2.5 minutes. And there are systems that run trains at that thing. The maximum time you can run a train headway is about 90 seconds, but the fact of the matter is that the problem with buses is that when you have them buses that Tom was talking about 180 an hour, the problem with buses when you have 180 down the hour is that you are faced with the fact that you are overwhelming the streets. You're building a situation where you have one bus right after another, whereas a train can haul people through an intersection in groups, and therefore you
Okay.
have a pause
Time.
between trains.
Time. Tom?
If we're talking about street running light rail, I've never seen anything remotely approaching 8,000 passengers an hour. I've done the math many times, many ways. The biggest light rail system I've seen, which I was in charge of for a while, the Blue Line from Long Beach to LA, the most favorable comparison, it had about a little bit more capacity than a freeway lane. Best comparison. Overall, I usually find it's somewhere like a third, maybe a quarter of a lane. The math is not that difficult I'm not going to go through it now, but anybody who's interested, see me later. Yes, our Broadway with 180 buses was an exception, and the street was set up specifically to be buses through the heart of LA, and we moved 180 buses an hour in each direction. We had at least 2 bus stops on every block, some of which would serve 6 or even 8 different lines,
Okay.
but we moved them.
This question, I think we're going to have Tom go first here to be fair. Discuss how your technology, shall we say, works with the complete streets and why one might be better than the other.
Okay.
Tom first.
Oh, sorry. Apologies.
Well, I like the complete street movement as long as we don't go too far. When we do, what we find out is the different modes do not play together well at all. For example, in Tucson, the new streetcar line there has caused a huge number of bicycle accidents near the campus because if you ride your bike too close to the rail, which is embedded, you get too close and you're going in the same direction, your tire will be caught. There was one unfortunate young student who, she will never be the same. The settlement was $3 million, which will be supporting her for the rest of her life. Terrible. What works better is that if you match things up logically, for example, you have one street that is focused on people, pedestrians, etc., and perhaps the next street over, if you can do it in your town. This is a focus on cars. And there are places that have done that. Curitiba, Brazil did a brilliant job of that. Everybody knows about the busways, which are tremendous. But you go one block either side, you have one-way streets for cars.
Dave?
We have to recognize that streets are for people, and the idea that you're going to have one-way streets and dedicate to cars, et cetera, is not the way that cities have worked all over the world for millennia. And they aren't working that way today. And one of the biggest problems is cars, the overwhelming use of automobiles that's causing the problem. You have to have, whereas both buses and rail are much more compatible with walking and with bicycles and with other modes, including wheelchairs. People walk all over the tracks all over the world, and they also ride all over the tracks. I have many pictures in Europe where people in Czechoslovakia, in the Czech Republic, and in Germany riding their bicycle right down the middle of the right-of-way. So the idea that some bicyclists have a problem, I'm a bicyclist, is also a matter of whether or not you practice safety. I drove up here, and I practice safety when I drive. Some people don't. So the idea here is that with complete streets, you really are going to be better off with a rail system that comes periodically than running 180 buses down the street.
Okay, switching order again, Dave first. What are the operating and maintenance costs per mile of light rail versus bus?
Well, I think the answer to that is very simply that if you look at the National Transportation Database, you'll find that overall, light rail operates at about 2/3 of the cost per passenger mile, and that's the best comparison that you can make. So if you have the volume, and we would have the volume here in Austin, it would be far cheaper over the long run. The life cycle cost of the light rail system will prove to be more economical than the bus for that reason. And there's lots of data to back that up. Now, there are systems, light rail systems and streetcar systems, that aren't doing very well or doing as well as they should. But a lot of that is looking at a window or a snapshot. You can always take a system when it first opens and criticize it. I mean, people criticize SH-130. It's failed twice and had to be refinanced by the bond houses. But someday it's going to be a very heavily traveled road. But it takes a long time to get there. And that's true of transit system. You're changing the way that people move and the way that they live. So you have to look at this in the long term.
Tom?
If what you do is you take the national costs or the agency costs for light rail and for bus and comparison, light rail will look like its costs are lower. that's not the right comparison.
Okay.
What you want to do is take comparable types of bus service. That's the right comparison. When you do that, and I have done it many times, and I'll be happy to share some of my comparisons, bus kicks butt. When you load up buses and you get heavy loads, that brings the cost, the subsidy per passenger way down, and it can be very good service because you can get to a heck of a lot more places, both with variations on individual lines and the total network.
Okay, 2 more questions. We'll start this time with Tom. In terms of integrating the network for transit, how do light rail lines work with each other, and how do bus lines work with each other, and which would be better from your point of view?
Well, there are pros and cons, and anytime you have a light rail line or system, you also have to carefully integrate it with the buses. With buses, again, ideally you've got a nice grid system, which makes for very easy transfers. If you have that type of city, you can get almost anywhere with 2 buses at the maximum. Light rail, when you're running buses with light rail, the difficulty is you've got to get the bus to the light rail station before the train and then keep it there until the train leaves. And you frequently have to take the bus offline and have it sit there after traveling some extra distance. So it hurts bus. This is one of the reasons why in combined system buses statistics look worse. But it can be done. It's a matter of just having professional transit schedulers and planners do it right the first time. And it can be done. You just have to know what you're doing.
Dave?
We don't have a grid system in Austin, and that's one of the reasons that rail will work as well as it does. We have a system of a line village from northeast to southwest, and that line village is very constricted in the middle, and we have a lot of suburbanites who want to get into the city, and we've got to feed that core or it's going to die, and it's going to hurt the tax base of the city, and we need to encourage development. My friend Lyndon Henry, my associate, he says we're building transit-orientated development without the transit, and he's right. We're building all these condos all over town. We have no way to move these people. It's going to be a disaster, and I can see it in my driving around town. Now, as far as integrating, yes, it is a matter of getting good transit people to integrate buses and trains, and it's done all over the world. It can be done. Sometimes we don't have competent people. It's very hard in America, where we don't have transit like they do in Europe, to have the professionals that we need, because we have still building that cadre of professionals who are going to do this job.
Okay, last question. We'll start with Dave first. How will current and future transportation technology impact the prospects for light rail or buses? How will current and future transportation technology impact the prospects for either light rail or buses or both?
Am I first?
You are first.
Okay. I think you're making a reference to self-guided cars and so forth. I think that it, first of all, and I know this has come up at the conference, you have to realize it's going to take years to use the stock of cars and equipment that we have now. Everybody says, oh, we're going to have electric cars. Well, I'm not going to buy an electric car. I got a 1989 Camry and a 1996 Camry, and they both run fine, and I'm not getting rid of it. So it's going to take a long time to make this change. The second thing is that there's a lot of problems, as you know from reading about Google, with self-guided cars. And third, think about the insurance implications of a self-guided car and the car ahead of you. You know how we drive down the freeway a few feet from the guy ahead of us? You think the insurance companies are going to allow that kind of behavior out of a computer? It's got to have a longer thing. You're going to cut the freeway capacity in half, because the insurance company aren't going to stand for having those self-guided cars operate in that manner. They're going to have a bigger envelope around them for safety reasons. So there's a lot of problems here, and I don't see that they're going to get solved that fast, but that's my opinion.
Well, we have some slightly different views on automated vehicles. Frankly, one of the great advantages is you will be able to operate with far, far shorter headways. And this has already been proven. And that includes idiots who are trying to break into the line. That technology has been proven for quite a while. Now, nothing is foolproof. The fools are too damn ingenious. We have spent a lot of money on technology. I've gone through a lot of it. Frankly, in many cases, I wish we had just put the money into more service on the street with good old-fashioned transit professionals. There hasn't been all that much in transit that's been all that new that has really made a big difference. I mean, streetcars are technology from the 1890s.
That's right.
And you know, they worked very well for a long time. That was the Silicon Valley around 1900. But times have passed.
Okay, we're going to enter the conclusion wrap-up stage now. So Tom is going to go first, since Dave is the one trying to make the point. Tom's got 5 minutes, and then Dave has 5 minutes.
Thank you. Transit in Austin is a niche player, and it has been losing share for a long time. To those that depend on it, it is very important. But when you try to do things with transit that transit can't do, you wind up wasting money and hurting the people who really need transit to get around because they don't have other options. The people I'm talking about are the old and the young, those with physical issues, those with financial issues, and particularly students in UT, which is a very large portion of the total ridership with Austin Transit. Choice riders are few, but the main transit growth strategy in Austin appears to be make driving worse. It isn't working. Well, it's working and making driving worse, but people are still driving. Why? Because it takes half the time to get to work. Okay, there isn't going to be parking. You know what? They will find a way. Some people, yes, but people like to drive. It has worked very well for them. You have options. You can pick your time. You can go all the way. You don't have to wait in the heat or the rain. You have the ability to change your time of travel, respond to an emergency. This is why transit has a 2% overall market share, 5% for home to work, where it does the best, and it just is not gaining. It has been constant to losing for decades. As we've discussed, the greater Austin area is very difficult to serve with transit. If you ran light rail through the main core into downtown, with the streets we have, it would be very, very slow, many stops, doubtful you could get to a dozen miles an hour or that. I don't think you could. Now, apparently they like the speech. One thing we have to remember about, if we want to move more residential development downtown and more commercial development downtown, even if a large percentage of those people walk or bike to work, you are still going to generate a huge number of new auto trips for the people who don't live there and don't have transit. That type of development will generate far, far more trips, auto trips, which will be bad. It will be very difficult to get around, to get to the place, get through the place. So, we are now embedded in Metro Rail, and while it's expensive, it is being utilized. It should do what it can to get more out of it, including increasing service. After that, please leave it alone. Go to other things that will work faster, better, cheaper. Look at commuter bus, including, if necessary, in that same corridor, if that's needed to take the loads off. It's faster. For the things that transit does well, do them. Carry the people who need a way to get around and don't have options. Stop wasting your time trying to do things that doesn't do well. If you want to do development, if you want to do jobs, if you want to do anything like that, the way to do it is to carry more people on transit, not to try to attract the yuppies out of their BMWs. It's too damn expensive. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. We are faced with the fact that not only is technology changing, but so are tastes changing. We have a young group of people, we call them millennials, and they want to live in dense urban environments. My granddaughter went off to Chicago here for the last 6 months to work up there because she wanted to live in a city. She's coming home because she doesn't like cold weather. But the point I'm trying to make is that not only our tastes are changing, but we are faced with some needs as cities become larger to move larger numbers of people in ways that are less destructive to the existing neighborhoods and to the existing development, and encourages development in those places where we want it. There's no evidence to speak of that buses encourage development anywhere. Sometimes people point to the Cleveland medical line as an example, but most of those examples are close to their metro rail system, where the buses and the rail come together. So what I'm trying to say is that you have to think about the right technology in the right place. And in the case of Austin, the right technology is rail, and it's gonna, whatever goes through downtown, whether it's buses on dedicated lanes, we already have some dedicated lanes, some paint on the street, or whether it's trains, it's not gonna go very fast. You can't think that every trip is equal to every other trip. A trip through the center core of the city is different than a trip through out to Round Rock or out to Leander. That's a different kind of a trip. So you have to think about mobility in terms of what it does to the other forms of mobility. Good public transit causes people to walk. I'm sure most of you, or at least some of you, have been to New York City. How do you get around? Most of the time you walk. And you walk because there is a good subway system and there is a good bus system, and you walk around within the neighborhood where everything is right close at hand and everything is right there. And if you want to go to somebody else's neighborhood, you get on the subway or on the bus. And that is the way New York functions. New York is an excellent model, and we should try to build more cities like New York City because it works and it's efficient. There's a great article in National Geographic called The City Solution, and it explains why cities are so much more efficient than the suburbs. We're killing ourselves. We're killing ourselves with all our subsidies to roads and all of our subsidies for building houses and the disproportionate amount of money that can be available for cities. We're attacking the cities eventually. And a lot of our older people like myself want to move into the city. I can't afford it. I live 8 miles out, still in the city, but I can't afford to live downtown because there isn't enough tight urban development where I can find an apartment or a condo I want to live in. Not in my income. I'm on a fixed income. So that's the world we need to create. And transit isn't just for the poor. Transit is for everybody. And a lot of people are moving into cities who have the means and are taking up space and buying condos and so forth, older retired people like myself. And the reason they're moving into these cities is because there's good transit. Austin's a party city, and one of the things that'll improve the tax revenue is having really good public transit in this town for South by Southwest, Austin city limits, and so on. Where are we at, Brew?
A minute and 50.
Okay. The situation with Austin's transit system is struggling mostly because of what politicians have done to it. Why is it a vote necessary for rail but not a vote necessary for the buses? This makes no sense. So we're faced with the fact that what's happened with public transit in America has largely been caused by political decisions, largely influenced by people who sought to profit in the short term for the policies of government. Around Austin, land speculation is a big thing. And that's why they want these roads out there, because they're flipping these parcels of land. When they built the outer loop out here, you should have seen what happened to all the parcels of land before it became public they were going to build the outer loop. That's what's happening. We have to look seriously at the corruption that's involved in our government. It's a big problem, and it's causing us problems with our national debt and local debt and so on. And we got to have more choices. And we have to build the appropriate transit in the appropriate place. And that's the point where Tom and I disagree. But that's fine. We've been friends for years, and I appreciate him coming. Thank you.